All right, this is Mack Bolen, and we are live tonight. This is my third installment of Seriously People. Tonight, my special guest is fellow veteran and former Illinois resident Jason Butler. Tonight, we're going to talk about a subject that I'm going to have to say, based particularly on a lot of the letters I read to the editor in the Chicago Tribune, total ignorance. And to start it off, to quote one of the great Nobel Prize winning economists, Milton Friedman, Jason,
there's no such thing as a free lunch.
That's right. And what does that mean?
Oh, don't get stuff for free. Someone has to pay for it in the end.
That's right. So all you socialists out there, keep that in mind. So just to kind of give a background, have to posture a little bit here. Okay, I spent 24 years in the military. Most of it was in special forces. I've been all over the world. Education-wise, though, I started out at Augustana College, where I also wrestled. Started as a biology major, left there, finished my degree while I was in the Army at Methodist University. I had a double major in history and business, minor in economics, did some post-grad work. When I got out, retired, came back here, worked for my folks in the housing industry. We had multi-family tenant units, some commercial mixed property. So I have a pretty strong handle on the subject. And Jason, you spent time in the service, and where did you got your MBA from?
So I got my MBA from the University of Texas down in San Antonio. I was already pretty ingrained in with the company that I work for, Accenture, which is an IT consulting company. And what I did was I did our financial forecasting for financial services business unit. We have different business units, whether it's digital technology operations, products, oil and gas, financial services. So I did a lot of our headcount forecasting and planning, really digging into the data to see how we can grow our business and our people. My MBA really helped me get a lot of the real world aspects of what's going on and being able to tie it into just our business as a whole.
Yeah, a little bit later when we start talking about things like cost of living, we'll bring up the difference between where I'm at or where you were at and where you were at before in Illinois versus where you're at now in Texas. Yeah. So speaking just background-wise on economics, okay, if you look back in history, economics has been around pretty much forever. If you go all the way back to maybe primitive bartering systems, and as civilization advanced, trade became a little bit more complex. Civilizations developed currency, which made things easier. And we can talk about economic systems. Okay, start off with back in the day, if you lived in a monarchy, the king pretty much controlled everything, and you paid taxes to the crown.
Right.
And then later, revolutions, things changed. And I'll talk first about capitalism. And Jason, when we talk about capitalism, you know the deal: laissez-faire, invisible hand, free market enterprise. So in layman's terms, to you, when you talk about capitalism, what does that mean to you?
So when you're talking about capitalism, you're really looking at the market guiding and directing the business of the state. It's an economic political system where the country's industry and the trade are controlled by private owners and not by the government. And there's in the current economic system, don't want to get ahead of myself, but in our current economic system, capitalism has created the most wealth in this country, in the world ever. And so when we start talking about systems of economics, capitalism is hotly debated because it's created a lot of wealth and it's created a lot of gaps in wealth.
Sure. Yeah. And speaking through history. Now, when we talk about, and I'll bring up obviously Karl Marx, German, who wrote a very famous book called Das Kapital. And it was kind of an indictment on capitalism, where he felt that the working class was exploited, which at the time was a fairly fair statement in some sectors. And his point was about control, about a centralized government that controlled the workers, that and he called, obviously the bourgeois, or the wealthy class, the ruling class. And of course, back then we're talking about a lot of countries still had kings and queens. And his point was about the collective, about a centralized government controlling the output, controlling wages, and basically leveling the playing field. But there were problems inherent with that system too, which is,
well, you use competition. Once you have made it let's say a fair playing field, where no matter how hard you work, or how much effort you put in to the growth of your business or to your personal finance, that if you know that the government is going to give you what you get, then you lose that competitive spirit.
Right. And, when we talk about other, centralized systems which are politically involved, like communism, socialism, they all have the same thing in common, in that they're centrally controlled. And you could even talk about Islam, if you look at Iran or countries like that, where they are still controlled by be it the mullahs or whatever, they're controlled by a central government.
Yeah.
And when we talk about free market enterprise, the way it's supposed to work, and the invisible hands, a market based on competition, the only problem was, and when capitalism took place, free market enterprise took place, obviously human nature, when it was involved, you have a certain element of greed and unethical practices. Now, when labor laws came into being, and they were a good thing, and when labor unions actually in the beginning came into being, they were a good thing, because you got rid of the child labor. You got rid of, you got a 40-hour work week. You got things like overtime. You got all the benefits of that. And for people who understand a free market and competition, when people say, oh, well, capitalism is about monopolies. No, actually, it's not. Capitalism is about competition. Monopolies restrict competition.
Exactly. When you look at pro-capitalists, that's one of, throughout history, legislation has been passed to kind of block monopolies and allow for more competition. So yeah, that's true.
And and I will point out right off the bat, if you want to look at today, one of the worst industries involving monopolies, when you talk about pharmacies. And that's something that if the government wanted to fix, they could, if there was more free competition. But with the patent laws, you end up with like that asshat with the EpiPen, who decided to jack the price up for $3,000 to $5,000. Now, fortunately, his ass ended up in jail, as it should have. But that goes completely against free enterprise and completely against competition.
Right. Yeah.
And if you look now, there were some industries, and they talk about what's known as public utilities, where the government is delivering I guess you would call it a need, like electricity, like gas. And those were areas where they said, okay, well, competition wouldn't necessarily be a good thing. We want something steady, a simple price. Now, for telecommunications, that changed, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, and that was a change for the better.
Regulation, and
that was a change for the better. So historically, one of the events that we have to bring up, labor unions, when they first started out, were a good thing. And for people who don't know who Upton Sinclair is, He was known as a muckraker. Muckrakers were guys who went in and wrote exposés, and he probably wrote one of the most famous and most important exposés called The Jungle. That was an indictment of the meatpacking industry. Now, I talked before about ethical practices in business, and in the meatpacking industry, they were at a point to where everything they did was unethical. They would manipulate payoff inspectors. They would purposely shove, rotted pork, stuff like that, into conveyor belts, and it was positive because he won a Nobel Prize, and it ended up in a massive change within the meatpacking industry and FDA standards and the kind of things. Now, when we talk about a free market and competition, I bring up ethics because government regulation got involved back then because you had a lot of unethical business practices going on. You know exactly what I'm talking about, Jason.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I mean, when you're talking about, wage fixing, when you're talking about, work weeks, regulation is needed. And, we had, at that time, especially during the roaring 20s and, pre-World War II, you had, you had a lot of people who were making a lot of money, and the country was doing really well. But you had a sector, you had a group of your blue collar workers that were really, producing a lot but not making a lot of wage. And we can kind of argue that is a part of how the Great Depression happened. Was that you saw many of the workers who took out loans to buy stocks and achieve that American dream kind of overextend themselves because they were producing a lot, but they weren't bringing a lot in. So that is one of the things that where government regulation is needed when you're trying to at least create a fairer system and eliminate that greed and that corruption that really hurts the working man and really chokes competition and competitiveness.
Right. And unethical business practice, in some cases illegal, some cases legal, but unethical, eventually caught up. And we talk about the 1929 crash. And it's important to note that, and I don't want to go over people's heads, when we talk about things like over leverage or whatever, where stock shares were being sold on the market, for a company that wasn't worth what it was being traded at.
Right.
And when you talk about markers, when you talk about futures, and to be fair, and I'm going to talk about this also, the stock market has always been a very event-driven entity. But when the 1929 crash hit, there was no backstop to these companies, to banks. You had bank runs. I love the New York Times headline on Black Monday basically just said Wall Street lays an egg. Mm. But on the plus side, a lot of the changes that came out from the Great Depression and the stock market crash, we got the SEC, we got the FDIC, we got and we got 1933, the Glass-Steagall Banking Act, and that's going to be important a little bit later on too. So this was a growing pain, and this was a wake-up call, I think, for the United States. And it was a period, the Great Depression was a rough period because it was also, coincidental with a really bad weather that destroyed a lot of crops, that put a lot of people in a bad position. Social Security came out of this. Some people don't like it. Some people think it's a good thing. There's pro and con to both, but, at least you got something. You got a system, a backstop. Right. So during this time period, and I want to kind of take a little bit leap forward, of course, this is when, and this is not a good thing, when labor unions, I was saying again, first started, it was a good thing. But during the Great Depression and going through the 30s and 40s, they got involved with organized crime, and they started to become a kind of self-serving entity that they were the flip side opposing, which was, you know, your corporations, your management, and a lot of your really bigger labor unions, particularly the United Auto Workers, and some of them had a direct impact on what's going to come in the 70s that I'm going to talk about here shortly. So, Jason, you're obviously you're a little bit younger than me, but you know, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and during that time period, that's when you pulled into a gas station.
There's no gas.
well, no, but you pulled in, and gas was 29 to 30 cents a gallon.
Oh.
And the guy came out and said, "Do you want regular or high test?" And then he would clean your windshield. He would open up your hood. He would check your oil. He would look at your washer fluid, fill your gas tank. And again, you were paying 29 to 30 cents a gallon. And then sometime during that time period, things started to change. And during the 70s, and there were, to be fair, you know, it was bad moves on both sides, bad moves on management, bad moves on the labor unions, where you had strikes going on, and the steel industry at the time were still using the old blast furnaces. Now, if you went over to Japan, when they started to modernize, all their plants were electrical.
Right.
And so if they had to shut down, they could fire back up within a day. If a U.S. steel company shut down, to get the furnaces and everything going, it took them 3-4 days at least. And the 70s went through a period where we went from where we were at to hyperinflation, and prices just started to skyrocket. It got so bad in 70, I want to say around 73, President Nixon instituted a wage price freeze.
Okay.
Now, the problem is it's a good thing and it's a bad thing. And as we talked about a little bit ago, you know, most presidents don't have a direct impact on economy and almost no impact on the stock market or futures exchange. But it was an artificial barrier put in place. Now, when it was eventually removed, everything went berserk. Everything went up. And as you know, some people said, well, why not just freeze prices? Don't freeze wages. Well, what happens? You know, you have when wages go up, what happens to prices?
Yeah, they go up.
And it's and that's one of the things we talk about economic indicators. Now, one of the things that hit the U.S. hard during that time period, and let's talk about market elasticity. Something, you know, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with. You know, like if the price of beef goes real high, people would buy maybe pork or go to something different. But particularly in the auto industry, and again, I talk about being a child of the 70s, you know, if you looked at the product that U.S. automakers were putting out at the time, particularly like Ford and Chevrolet, they were in a very elastic market, and people started buying imports, particularly like the Japanese Hondas, Toyotas, and the U.S. auto industry took a huge, huge hit.
Well, I mean, the things with, you know, when you're talking about elasticity is that it's always changing. It's always changing with the demand, and it's really hard to predict. And that's one of the things that, you know, from the readings that I've done is that, you know, when you're looking at market indicators and you're looking at, you know, just forecasts and predictions, it's really hard to predict that. And when you're starting to, especially in the 70s and 80s, you know, move into more of a global economy, it becomes increasingly tough to see, you know, where that demand is going to shift to.
Sure. And, you know, to give an idea of an inelastic market up until we'll call the information age, you know, computers, you know, there was IBM and maybe Texas Instruments and pretty much nobody else.
Yeah. For
a long time. And in the phone industry, and I'm going to get to that one here shortly soon. So when you talk about the stock market, and a lot of people like to cite averages and this and that, when I want to remind people, when you talk about the stock market and the futures, they are more event driven. Most presidents have almost zero impact on stock market prices or futures.
None.
Yeah. In fact, it was funny when I was working on my degree, going to night school, and that there was a Kiplinger letter that was a monthly newsletter, and it was economically based. And for some bizarre reason, out of nowhere, they predicted some kind of downturn. And for 2 months, they ignited a stock market crash. It wasn't a real big one, but I mean, it was just based on information that wasn't even backed up.
Yeah.
Because when we talk about markets, we talk about speculation.
And people have seen it in movies, whether you're watching Wall Street and you're watching Bud Fox, spread rumors, in the market. I mean, people have seen it and they've seen how markets move. It's just, sometimes it's just in a movie and you don't really equate it to real life, but that's all it is. It's information and it's opinion, and it's the market moving and ebbing and flowing. And that is what's driving the stock market.
Right. And I like to point this one out when I talk about the futures. I call it the gold rush. Back in the 70s, price of gold was hovering maybe around $380 per troy ounce. And you had the revolution in Iran. And then you had the hostage crisis. And all of a sudden, that price of gold started to skyrocket.
Yeah.
And being a futures markets can be volatile. In this case, the price of gold shot all the way up to $800 per troy ounce from around 380. That lasted for a while, and I don't want to get into specifics about going short in the market or going long in the market. That's something, folks, if you want to, research on. But a lot of people jumped in at the tail end of that market and lost their asses, because within a few years, that price of gold just, bam, went right down again.
Yeah.
And that's why I say now people say, okay, if you want to get in the stock market, blue chips, stick with something solid, stick with something straight. I don't want to go into a lot of detail on that. But again, understand that things like that are event driven. And you have a lot of people out there who are speculating. Now, if you just want to make a simple investment, after 9/11, some people panicked, and we had the same thing happen. The minute they opened the stock market, you knew it was going to crash. But again, other than companies that went bankrupt, there's pretty much nothing you can do about that.
Massive.
Something goes bankrupt, and a lot of people lost their asses on that. But if you didn't sell and you hung on and you waited, the market did rebound, as we both know.
Right.
So let's jump a little bit forward here, talk about economic indicators. And when we talk about economic indicators, GDP is a big one that a lot of people like to pay attention to, but I'm going to kind of undercut that fallacy. CPI, debt, unemployment rate. You have your currency exchange. Back in the 80s, the dollar at one point was worth 3.4 German marks. Now, at that point, with a strong dollar, a lot of people were buying the hell out of German automobiles and everything else they could because of the strength of the dollar relative to it. But again, exchange rates come and go, and they rise and they go down. And some people like to play that game. Again, that's another one you can get burned in really bad. When we talk about GDP, Jason, and I know you and I are both in agreement on that, GDP is not the end all.
No,
And
no, go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
No, it's just, when it's an indicator, it's a leading indicator. And gross domestic product, for those that don't know what GDP is and how it relates to the way our economy works. I mean, it like we've talked about, it ebbs and flows.
Yeah.
Right now, one of the big things that comes out of Trump supporters is they talk about GDP being over 4%, and how that is, the market, and it's equals money for everyone. And the American economy is like the Titanic. It's huge, and there's a lot that goes into it. And we can't get just lost in GDP by itself, because again, there's different markets and there's different leading indicators that even though we may have a strong GDP, that doesn't necessarily mean that the functions of our economy is strong. So I don't like people to get caught up on single metrics, because there's a lot more to it.
Absolutely. And the key word, and I want to point this out because I hate to rip on, well, no, I don't hate to rip on California, but I'm going to rip on California anyway. The key word in GDP is gross. And you have to look at other things like debt. And in the case, and I want to talk about California specifically, because people like to tout that they have this phenomenal GDP, which they do. However, if you go to BLS, Bureau of Labor and Statistics, their RDP, which is real domestic product, is way lower when you factor in that California leads the nation per capita. And this is scary because they're the largest, that's the most populous state in the country. They lead the country per capita in federal and state welfare payments. They have the highest debt in the country per capita. And when you add that in, you realize, and I know, Jason, you've looked online, you've seen some of the pictures that come from San Francisco and Oakland and Los Angeles and San Diego, where you have a huge portion of the population that is destitute.
Completely.
And a cost of living based on their tax laws that is absolutely brutal, because they tax pensions and Social Security in addition to to just a normal state income tax. And for people who don't understand the entire picture when we talk about economics, cost of living is an important point, because when you talk about high taxes, that affects the cost of living and what your disposable income is. Again, talking about economic indicators, like if you're paying less property taxes on your house in one state versus what another guy is in another state, you have more disposable income, right? What you can pay on goods and services, or on your kids' schooling, or whatever, your housing, and that's an important point that is lost in a lot of this. And so is debt. And right now, as we know, the U.S. has a massive debt, and it's gone up completely.
Yeah, I don't think the U.S., when we look at the debt and paying it off, I mean, this is me speaking, from my opinion. Mm-hmm. I don't think we'll ever be able to pay it off. So then what the next thing we need to talk about is what are our deficits? What is our incoming revenues against that debt? And it's just like if you you think of Bill Gates, or you think of Donald Trump. Think of Donald Trump and how much debt he may have. He may have millions of dollars in debt, but what does he have coming in? Mm-hmm. So the average guy like me, if I have $1 million in debt, that is going to bankrupt me. I'm done.
Right.
A Donald Trump type, that's actually good for him. The banks are going to look at him as a healthy investment. So it really depends on what you have coming in your revenues. We'll never be able to pay off our debt. There's too many countries that are really invested in America right now. And, we can start talking about tariffs, and we can start.
Which we will.
And just the trade deficits and picking up ground. But it'll take a massive effort and a total change in how we do business to really reduce our debt, because it's almost impossible. Just on the interest alone, um, it almost matches the amount of revenue the country brings in. So,
Sure. And speaking of that, we'll talk about economic trends. And, we talk about like unemployment, and unemployment can be trending downward or upward, uh, and like the GDP growth, et cetera. Um, and to be fair, and I'm going to talk about this, particularly when I talk about the Bush years, and we're going to talk about the Obama years, and I'm definitely going to talk about the 2007 recession and the reality, the truth about it, which a lot of people have absolutely no clue about. But when you look at averages, for instance, Bush, when he came into office, had a recession, which was based on the burst of the info techno industry that started in the third quarter of August of 2000, way before he took office. And that wasn't Bill Clinton's fault either. I'm not going to blame him. And then again, at the end, he was hit with a recession, and we'll talk about the key factors that contributed to that. And now, Obama was not responsible for the recession. And if you looked at average numbers, yeah, they're bad. But while he was in office towards the end, the economy was trending upward. The unemployment was going down. And to be fair, while Trump is in office, it continued, so that's something to be happy about.
Right.
And speaking about wage and prices again, and you hear a lot about people saying, well, we want a $15 wage, or we want this and that. Going back to Milton Friedman, when we say, there's no such thing as a free lunch. The fact is, if wages go up, prices are going to go up. That's a fact.
Right.
That is what is known as an economic reality. And all these people who demonstrate and want more money, what they don't realize is you're influencing the cost of living. And if you think that your wage is not, that the prices aren't going to go up with your wage going up, you're kidding yourself.
Well, I mean, it's hard for the average person who, let's say, you have a $500 million lottery, and they say, you know what?
Yeah.
Why don't we give $1 million to 500 people? Or why doesn't the government give every tax-paying American $1 million?
Because
homes would be, because you would just have all of this, everyone would have money. And what they don't realize is that if you flood the market with cash, if you flood the market with millions of dollars, all of a sudden Jason Butler's a millionaire, and my neighbor's a millionaire, and my other neighbor's a millionaire. Well, then $1 million isn't worth $1 million anymore.
There you go.
Price is going to go up to account for all of the money that's coming to the market. And so now you go to get that burger, that dollar burger is now $10 or $100. And it's something that I've heard people say and ask. And it's, even if you try to explain it, like, you give people more money, prices are going to go up. They still it's still hard for them to understand. And I kind of related back to, if you had a business and you're pricing something at, let's say, $5, you're selling burgers at $5, and everyone that's coming in is, ready to spend hundreds of dollars in your establishment, well, then you're going to raise your price up. You're going to
absolutely
make more money. So yeah, that is something that, I think
it's an economic reality, and that's what people have to understand, because the way the market works, when wages go up, prices are going to go up. It's a natural flow. And ironically, and I like to throw this in there because people complain about Chick-fil-A, but Kathy, the CEO of Chick-fil-A, pays his workers $17 an hour.
Yeah.
Has a great benefit program, and they're never open on Sunday, yet they slam at him and Chick-fil-A because of his beliefs. And the funny thing is, they're never open on Sunday, but the one Sunday they were open on was when he sent all the Chick-fil-A workers down to Orlando after the Pace nightclub shooting to hand out free sandwiches to people in the community.
Oh, okay.
One of the great ironies, you know, and that's why he's ranked as one of the top CEOs in the country.
Yeah.
Another guy, you know, we talk about the American dream, Donald Thompson. Now, I mentioned that, and I guarantee you just about everybody, and if you're a Black American, you probably have no idea who I'm talking about. Donald Thompson's a guy who was raised by a grandmother in one of the worst neighborhoods in Chicago, and he rose to CEO of McDonald's.
Yep.
And even though, you know, he eventually resigned, but he was a product of the American dream that shows that if you have hard work, determination, you can make it.
He was an engineer by trade. I was actually something on YouTube with when he was the CEO, and how he had to go back and make a burger and learn how to make a burger and how to run a McDonald's, and all of his engineer training just didn't matter. And he just really had to get into the DNA of the company and understand the business. I thought that was really interesting.
It was. And that's one of those success stories, unfortunately, you don't hear enough of. You know, more is the pity. Now, we talked about that. I want to talk real quick about when we talk about the trade tariffs, because you hear that a lot in the news lately, import and export and trade imbalance. Now, one of the a very strong economic indicator is import-export. If you're a country and you're exporting way more, or if you're importing way more than you're exporting, then you've got problems.
Right.
Because you don't have natural resources, so you have to bring them into your country. Now, and this is one of those things that really pisses me off, because I read these letters from ignorant letter writers of the Tribune all the time who talk about simple economics and tariffs. And let me explain something to you folks. First of all, Canada is one of the worst countries in the world for tariffs. They place anywhere from 250 to 400% tariffs on American dairy products. Aluminum and steel, forget it. Japan, one of the worst. Anything you want to import into Japan, they're going to slam with everything. And it doesn't matter if it's automobiles, raw materials, they're brutal. Now, the EU, and, you know, people talk about the U.S. automobile industry, and the fact is the U.S. puts a 2% tariff on automobiles coming from France, England, Germany, etc. The EU imposes a 10% tariff on American automobiles. So we've always been dealing with a trade imbalance. And I'm going to mention about farm subsidies, because I hear that BS being talked about too. American farms have been subsidized since the late 1800s. And if you don't understand about farming, because you hear them talk about how much money the government pays, if a farmer does not leave several plots of land fallow, he will overfarm and he will destroy the soil. You have to rotate crops. And I don't want to get off on a tangent here, but South Africa is getting ready to have a huge eye-opener, because a lot of the land they've seized that was unused is being overfarmed and destroyed. So basically, and I don't remember the statistic I read recently, they've lost about 20% of usable farmland over farming because they gave land to people who didn't know what they were doing. You have to rotate crops. American farms have been subsidized for years. It's a false talking point. So when you look at trades and tariffs, you have to realize, and Jason, you know what I'm talking about. How long has the U.S. been dealing with a trade imbalance?
Generations.
Yeah, for a long time. And, you know, and I don't want to get political on this because I'm not a Trump fan, and obviously you're not either. But one thing that we talk about, you know, people may slam him about renegotiating trade agreements, but we've been dealing with awful trade agreements with Asia and Europe and NAFTA for years.
Yeah, I think that I I think when you ask maybe the independent voter that question about the president and tariffs, they will agree with you that the U.S. has been crushed with trade imbalances, and there needs to be something done to really balance this. And I think where the president is losing the support, and no matter what, he's going to get slammed on the left.
Yeah, right.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But the way that he's communicating and the way in which it looks like these tariffs are being implemented are through Twitter. So it's kind of
it's a perception. No, I understand. Yeah.
thing. And so it's like, okay, does he really know what he's doing? And there may be some huge implications to these tariffs that are affecting, like you saw with Ford looking to lay off 20,000 white collar workers because of steel tariffs. And that may be, again, the market correcting itself. Maybe that may be just it may be a part of just the ebb and flow that we've been talking about. It's just the haphazard nature of the communication strategy that's led a lot of people to believe this is not a good thing for America.
Sure, but in reality, this is something that we've been dealing with for decades that needed to be addressed.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and the thing is, what people don't understand, when particularly in the Asian markets, we have such a horrible trade imbalance with China. It's embarrassing. It's absolutely embarrassing because we import so much more from them than what we export to them, and they limit American exports to their country. I mean, the government actually limits what comes in. And I mentioned before, Canada, Japan, a lot of these countries are so protectionist on their own home markets and their home exports that, they will do whatever it takes to protect them. And that is one of those things that I wish was better communicated, because people in this country don't understand what we've been dealing with for years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good.
Yeah, so I want to talk real quick now about the 2007 recession. One of those things that also a lot of people just don't understand a lot about what actually happened. And, and I want to keep this apolitical. I'm not finger pointing, but there were certain events that took place. One of them being the CRA enhancement. And CRA is a community reinvestment. And they're basically an oversight, a regulatory commission on housing loans. And in 1997, they went out and started kind of pressuring smaller banks, et cetera, to increase their loan scope. Now, I speak on this with personal knowledge because my mother sits on the board of the Oak Park River Forest Community Bank Loan Board, and we dealt with this specifically. One of the other things that happened, as we mentioned before, Jason, 1933 Banking Act, right? And one of the reasons that was put in place was to prevent banks from engaging in the kind of activity that got them in trouble in 1929. Well, during the Clinton administration in 1999, they repealed two key clauses, 21 and 22. And I'm not going to let the Republicans off the hook here, because Newt Gingrich and the GOP-controlled Congress were on board with it. And they basically allowed banks to engage in the kind of venture capitalism that got them in trouble back in 1929. Hello, people. What the heck were you thinking? I mean, for crying out loud. What did you not think that they were going to go ahead and jump on board and start investing money recklessly? Which, of course, as you and I both know, that's exactly what happened. And then the third part of the tragedy was when Franklin Raines was appointed head of the Fannie Mae, the housing, federal housing, and he started to buy up a ton of subprime loans. And he was crooked. He later got busted. He actually ripped the industry, his own organization off. But the big thing is he got involved in subprime loan buying. Now, if you don't understand what was going on during this period, interest rates had dropped to a point to where everybody was trying to buy houses.
Well, I mean, you also had a big push from Cuomo. Cuomo
Absolutely.
Parenthood, and he wanted, I think it was by 2000, they wanted to have about $1 trillion in new loans to low income and minority homes, and you know, Freddie and Fannie were almost instructed to make almost 50% of their loans at the subprime level. So it was almost like, you want to go for it, I'm going to give you the match and the gas to burn it all down. And that's, you know, that's where, you know, Clinton and his administration really, you know, besides kind of repealing Glass-Steagall and getting into the CRA, you know, it was a part of the problem.
Absolutely. And the thing is, you know, you look at it, and a key point here, we talk about, you know, credit, and people will talk about predatory loan practices, but predatory loan practices is kind of a half truth. I mean, there's two sides to it. And a point I bring up because I was guilty of it in my younger days, living beyond your means, relying on credit to get that thing you want now, instead of maybe saying, hey, you know, maybe I should wait and see. And what happened during that time frame, you had things like what they call ninja loans, which was no income, no job, no assets. You had balloon clauses, and a lot of people took balloon clauses on, and this was taking on one of those subprime loans, saying, well, okay, this is where I'm at my job now, and I'm taking a lower rate, but within 5 to 10 years, that rate's going to like double or triple, but I'm going to be earning more money then, because I'm going to have a better job. Well, in a lot of cases, that didn't happen. And when the irony in this that I love to point out, in 2003, the Bush administration tried to institute some kind of housing and lending reform. And one of his biggest critics was was Barney Frank.
No.
Yeah, he ripped out. And in fact, one of the reps in Georgia, gosh, I can't remember, Cynthia McKinney, literally made a statement: Bush don't want black people to own homes. And so that totally got shot down when he tried to institute housing and lending reform in 2003. Now, fast forward to 2006, and the Bush administration saw from economic advisors, hey, we see a runaway train. We see something bad coming. Graham McCain never even made the House floor because there was so much Democratic Party opposition to it. Then, of course, we all know what happened. When the bottom came up fast, the crash happened. We had a stock market crash. Banks started to fail. And the interesting thing is, again, I mentioned about my mother who was sitting on the loan board at Oak Park River Forest Community Bank. The CRA in 2005 approached him and said, hey, you know, we notice your loan area is restricted to kind of the River Forest Oak Park. Why aren't you loaning to the Austin District in Chicago, Melrose Park, Maywood, Forest Park? And they kind of said straight up, well, because none of the borrowers are qualified. Now, they bucked the system, and they were able to survive the tide. Unfortunately, a lot of the smaller banks, as you and I both know, you know, got killed.
Well, I mean, in some cases, the regulators would, you know, refuse mergers. They would refuse, you know, any type of branch expansions. They would limit the economic viability of that bank if they didn't give loans to certain people. So it was almost like holding a gun to their head.
Oh, absolutely.
Getting ready
Absolutely.
to jump off a cliff. So
yeah.
Those smaller banks were the first ones to go.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And they were strong armed, you know, I mean, it was brutal. And when the bottom fell out, you know, we all know what happened. And again, I say the great irony in this is because in 2010, when the Obama administration passed Frank Dodd, which finally reined in everything that had happened and instituted the regulations, it was kind of like closing the barn door after all the horses had already run out.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, when we talk about, you know, Skilling and Lay, who got absolutely skewered over the Arthur Andersen and Enron fiasco, but Franklin Raines, head of Fannie Mae, basically just got a slap on the wrist, you know, as a presidential appointee. He resigned. He paid a little bit of a fine, but he had a huge part in this. And on top of that, was guilty of fraud for, I don't remember what the exact fee was. It was probably around $20 million or so, but he was able to escape.
Yeah.
Now, that is a reality of what happened. And again, I don't blame Bush. You know, Bush took on a mini recession when he came into office. And then, of course, the massive recession when he left. And then Obama took on a huge recession. You know, and there was a lot of finger pointing in that. But what I just covered basically is reality of the situation of what happened. And hopefully that's something that people learn from. And we don't go into another phase like that again.
Yeah, one of the things, and this is kind of blowing my mind, I think I was reading it today, was, you know, how Trump reacted to, or the president reacted to
Yep.
The Fed increasing rates.
Yeah.
And he said they're crazy, they're out of their minds, and rates have been low for so long, and borrowing has been pretty aggressive, and the stock market, you know, has been going up. You know, it's going to come a time for there to be a correction. And, you know, ever since the repeal of Glass-Steagall, you know, no major bank crashes, no major bank recessions until, you know, the 2000s. So you had almost 60, 70 years of relative stability with the banks, but there's going to be a correction. It's just a matter of when. I know it sounds like the beginning to Armageddon or something, but
well, hopefully we won't see a raise in interest rates. Like, you know, again, if you go back to those late 70s and during the late Nixon and Carter era, where you had, you know, the Fed interest rate was at 14%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was brutal. Yeah, no, it was brutal. That's why so many people refied, you know, when the interest rates finally started to come down. Because, you know, imagine the mortgage you're paying on a home that's, say, you know, anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million at, say, 3 or 4% versus 12 or 14%. You'd get killed. You'd get crushed. You know, and that's one of the reasons why I don't want to see the Fed go up too much, you know, because, again, you're going to touch off a huge point of inflation. And in times of go ahead.
Correction, though, right? There has to be, well, not necessarily a correction, but if we are at, you know, 0%, 0 to 2% for so long, you know, if there is a time where we need to drop rates to spur economic growth, if we kept it here so long, so it's finding that medium, and I'm not going to pretend to know where that is, but I think if we can get rates up maybe another 2%, 2 to 3%, maybe that's where we need to kind of level off. But we've been at 0 to 2% for so long that you know, borrowing has been pretty strong, and you know, this is only a recipe for disaster. So, because there's no bottom anymore if we're at 0%. So.
Yeah, well, and again, I think a reasonable interest rate, you know, around 4 to 5% is fine. But when you start going up, because people who have variable interest rate loans are going to get killed.
Yeah,
and that's, you know, and that's one of the problems that you take on. You know, if you take on a big mortgage or you take on, you know, a big loan, when that rate is low based on what you're earning at that point, and then all of a sudden the Fed starts to increase on the interest rate, and all of a sudden, bang, you get caught saying, well, God dang, my payment was $375, now it's almost $700.
Yeah.
And again, that goes into the cost of living thing I talk about. And when we talk about taxes, and this is key, and this is one of the things I harp on a lot, because here in Illinois, we have a high debt. We have a lot of issues, and I'm not even talking about the crime stuff. I'm talking about a broken education system. But the only answer they have to anything is raising taxes. When you raise taxes, you raise the cost of living. Property taxes have quadrupled within just the last 10 years or so. And you have other ancillary taxes like bag taxes, water bottle taxes, et cetera, et cetera. But that all increases the cost of living. And when you increase the cost of living, you reduce the amount of disposable income within a household. Now, for people who say have the money, they move. And that's one of the reasons why Illinois leads the country in loss of population, because people are getting the hell out. The people you're crushing are the middle and lower classes who can't move, who are stuck. They can't just pick up and say, oh, I'm going to sell my house and just go to Indiana or Wisconsin or whatever. And unfortunately, that's the situation right now that is killing this state. And a large part of that has to do with public sector unions. And we talk about labor unions. Okay. In a classical labor union in the private sector industry, you have management and you have labor, and they negotiate and they come upon a contract. Now, in some cases, you hope you have fair bargaining and everything goes well. Some cases, one side or the other all of a sudden figures they have a raw deal and goes back on it. And I've seen it happen. But when you're talking about public sector unions, you're talking about, and again, when I was, in high school in the early 70s, there was no teachers union. If a teacher, they had a teachers organization, if they wanted a pay raise, they had a referendum. And the taxpayers would vote yes or no, because the taxpayers were funding their salary. Now, with public sector unions within the state of Illinois, it's out of their hands. Basically, the ruling party, which has been the Democratic Party here, decides and negotiates their contract. So after the vote is done, they can do whatever they want. And I'll be perfectly honest, in 2014 midterms, I voted for Toni Preckwinkle, who was the treasurer for Cook County, because she came up and said there's no plan to raise or expand taxes. And that lasted 6 months. And then
read my lips.
Yep, there you go. And taxes not only went up, but she instituted the sugar tax, which thank God that got shut down. But the property taxes increased to a point to where I look back 10 years ago, I was paying maybe $8,000 a year on an overassessed home, around $600,000, to where now it's over $12,000 semi-annually, which is insanity. It's insanity.
That's crazy. And
they're trying to bail out a broke system. And yet, about 10 years ago, when the CPS was broke, they gave the Chicago Teachers Union a 16.5% pay raise. Currently, Rahm Emanuel, on his way out, renegotiated with the AFSCME, which is the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. He just gave them a 10.5% pay raise. Again, that's on the taxpayer's dime in a city that's $300 million in debt. And again, we talk about economic realities. Well, if so many people continue and businesses leave the state, what happens to your tax base?
Yeah, your revenues are going to drop year after year.
And where are you going to get the money from?
You're either going to have to get it from the federal government, or you're going to have to just raise taxes and then continue to lose more people. or just go bankrupt.
Which, unfortunately, you know, according to the Illinois Constitution, the state can't declare bankruptcy.
Wow.
Yep.
Yeah.
And speaking about that, you know, because we heard, and I want to talk about credit ratings here because it's very important. One of the reasons Illinois and the city of Chicago and Cook County has a lot of problems is because their credit rating is so bad. So if they borrow money, they're going to pay an outrageous interest rate to pay it back. We remember back, you know, Cleveland defaulted. Now, one of the ways cities raise money is by bond issues. But if your credit's so bad, no one's going to buy your bonds. And that's what happened with Cleveland. You know, they had a bond issue. Tons of people lost a ton of money because they defaulted on the bond issue. And with a bad credit rating now, borrowing money for Chicago, Cook County and Illinois, they can't do it because the interest rates they would pay would be insane. So you're in a bad position.
Yeah.
Now, you live in Texas, which has no state income tax.
Right.
So that's one thing you don't have to deal with. And then secondly, your property taxes are fairly reasonable.
Yeah. Texas is, I want to say, the seventh San Antonio, where I'm at.
Yeah.
So the seventh largest city in the union, which is kind of weird. I never would have thought that. But there are, and someone threw this number at me, and I don't remember it exactly, but something to the tune of 150 to 200 families moving to San Antonio, just San Antonio, not Dallas, Houston, El Paso, Fort Worth, Laredo, just San Antonio. 150 to 200 families a day are moving, and it's because you have a large veteran community. Taxes are low. You can buy a 4-bedroom, 2-3-bath house, with on an acre of land for $200,000 with maybe your property taxes are somewhere between $4,000 to $5,000 a year.
Yeah.
So I mean, this is one of the places where it's actually very.
It's growing. It's growing.
You don't rent here. There's no reason to rent. So people move here, and we have younger people moving here. So you have more people in Texas, San Antonio specifically, and coming from Illinois. When we were getting out of the service, there was no way we were coming back to Chicago. As much as I, love Chicago, I love the wrestling, I love the community, but it was just not. Now you start to have a family, and downtown is great, but it's super expensive.
Oh yeah,
go downtown. So
try and park somewhere.
Yeah. So that's where you see more families moving, specifically to the south. I mean, to Texas, New Mexico, Arizona,
Florida.
Florida. Those areas, and it's funny because when you look at, and it's something that I've talked about a little bit. When you look at mainly democratically controlled cities, like you say, your New Yorks, your LAs, your Chicagos,
Oakland, San Francisco. Yeah.
Ridiculous, especially in the West. So ridiculous high homeless rate. Your veteran population is homeless and unemployed. Your taxes are sky high. And it is, relatively unsafe. And there's trouble with the minority community and the police. And, you can argue that's nationwide, but if you are in Chicago or LA or New York, you're seeing it a little bit differently. So it's almost and you're seeing a mass exodus from these large cities because people are saying, okay, I want more for my family. I want, more for myself. We talked about the, disposable income and being able to take what you've earned and use it, on what you want to use it on. And that's why you see a lot of people coming down here. And this is where we'll be for the foreseeable future.
Absolutely. And, my plan you know, when I'm done, you know, working for my folks, I'm getting the hell out of here. I'm probably heading to Naples, Florida, or San Antonio, Texas. So right now I'm kind of leaning more towards Naples, Florida, but you know, again, no state income tax. So right there, that takes a huge burden off of you tax wise. And then even the sales tax is half of what it is up here.
Yeah. What are you guys at right now?
It's around 11 to 12%, depending.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
we're
exactly.
6%. I thought you were at about 8.5.
Nope.
Must have gone up. Wow.
Yeah, it did. It's brutal. And then you go to states, you know, like in California, Minnesota, et cetera, where, you know, they don't just have a state income tax, but they tax pensions and Social Security. Minnesota too. You know, I mean, that's insane.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's brutal. And when we talk about taxes, that is why when you look at cost of living, taxes eat away at what you can spend. They eat away at your income, and they raise the cost of living. And that's why a lot of those particular states, like Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York City is probably one of the worst because they don't just have a state tax. If you work in New York City, even if you live in New Jersey, etc., you still have to pay a tax to New York. Yeah, it's insane, you know, and that's why people don't want to stay in places like that. And when we talk about taxes, it's based on your tax base. And the more the people leave, the less you're going to have to tax. And sooner or later, that bottom is going to come up. And Illinois right now is in that position where they may be the next California, you know, which is a disaster right now.
Yeah. I mean, what are you, I mean, with Rom leaving, I mean, what are you looking for in a city leader right now?
Who knows? You know, it's wide open right now, and there's really nobody good. It's unfortunate, but that's a fact. There's really nobody good. And the governor race, you know, people may be down on Rauner, but God forbid J.B. Pritzker gets in because you know he's going to raise taxes. He's already stated it, but he won't reveal exactly how he's going to. He says graduated income tax, but you know, no specifics.
What has Rauner done? You know, when I talked to some people in Illinois, they said that, you know, he was trying to fix the problems, trying to fix the budgets and actually get, you know, the houses in order. You know, has the state legislature actually allowed him to do that, or what?
No, because you have to remember the Illinois House and Senate is controlled by the Democrats. You have Madigan, who really runs the show, and Rauner ended up vetoing 2 budgets, which were totally irresponsible. The third one, his veto got overridden. We saw another property tax increase, like I mentioned, and I just feel, you know, if Pritzker gets in, he's probably going to not just expand the tax, raise the taxes, but I just know deep down inside, because he's a billionaire, he don't care. He'll go after Social Security and pensions. I mean, that seems to be the kind of the way they do it. You know, when I look at a lot of those other states that I mentioned.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate, but, you know, that's kind of the way things go. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here. So we talked about economics, you know, and I had my fellow veteran here, Jason. Jason, real quick, just mention about your service.
I joined the Army as an infantry officer. Went through officer candidate school in 2008, and I served all the way until 2014. So I did about 6 years, and then once I met my wife while I was in the service, and we had our kids, and he was ready to get out. So we got out 2014, and I had some really good experience. I met a couple of your brother in passing, and didn't know it, of course, until someone told me. But yeah, that was my my service.
Good. And again, folks, you know, this was a broad topic. We covered a lot of stuff. I don't know how many people view this, you know, archived. We didn't have a whole lot of live viewers, but if you do watch this video, please pay attention. There was a lot of good information put out here on a subject that a lot of people misunderstand. you want to read some really good quotes, if you want to really learn about true market capitalism, look up Milton Friedman. Very quotable, Nobel Peace Prize winner on economics, and probably one of the foremost authorities on what a successful capitalist free market should be. So this is Mack Bolen. I'm going to sign off now. Jason, thank you so much for being here. And don't know what the next one will be on, but I'm sure there will be one. So I'm going to say good night, everybody. Hope you enjoyed it.